The sunlight filtered through the large, crystal-clear windows, casting warm golden rays across the pristine, immaculate streets. Everywhere he looked, Marcus saw smiles. Neighbors waved as they passed by, children played in the parks, their laughter echoing through the air like a harmonious melody. Birds chirped from the carefully groomed trees lining the streets, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the breeze. Everything was perfect, perhaps a little too perfect. Marcus stood at the doorway of his home, surveying the world around him. His house, like all the others, was flawless. White walls, trimmed with light shades of gray, a neat garden with vibrant flowers, and a fence that never rusted or wore down. It had been this way for as long as he could remember. Yet, something gnawed at him deep inside, a vague, unsettling sensation he couldn't quite shake off. He smiled and waved back at his neighbor, Mr. Gray, who seemed to always be trimming the same hedges, day after day. "Morning, Marcus." Mr. Gray's voice was cheerful, just like every other day. "Beautiful weather, isn't it?" "Yeah, beautiful as always," Marcus muttered under his breath. He stepped back inside, closing the door softly. His wife, Emily, stood in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The same breakfast she made every morning, scrambled eggs, toast, and freshly squeezed orange juice. The routine was comforting, but lately, it felt suffocating. Predictable. Stale. "Good morning, love," Emily said without turning around, her voice as sweet and gentle as ever. "Your favorite, eggs just the way you like them." "Thanks," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. He sat at the table, watching her as she worked. Every movement was precise, practiced. Almost robotic. He blinked and shook his head. "What's wrong with me?" he thought. The day passed in a blur of sameness. Marcus went to work, though there wasn't really much to do. His colleagues laughed at the same jokes, shared the same stories they had told countless times before. The streets bustled with life, yet nothing ever truly changed. The sky was always clear, the temperature always pleasant. It felt like living in a dream that never ended. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Marcus's mind raced. Is this it? Is this all there is? A deep restlessness had taken root within him. He glanced over at Emily, peacefully sleeping beside him, her face serene, untroubled. He envied her. How could she be so content? Suddenly, something caught his attention, a flicker of light from outside the window. He sat up, peering through the glass. At first, he thought it was just a reflection, but no. There it was again. A faint, pulsing glow coming from the horizon, far beyond the limits of their perfect little town. His heart raced. Marcus got out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake Emily. He tiptoed to the door and slipped outside, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The streets were empty, silent except for the distant hum of the city. As he walked, the glow became clearer, more distinct. It wasn't the usual soft, golden glow of the city lights, it was something different. Something strange. He found himself drawn to it, as though an invisible force was pulling him closer. His feet moved on their own, leading him to the edge of town, where the perfectly paved streets ended and the carefully maintained landscape gave way to something else. Something wild and untamed. The glow pulsed again, more intensely now, casting eerie shadows along the trees. Marcus's breath quickened. He wasn't supposed to be here. No one ever came to this part of town. Why would they? Everything we need is back there, in the perfect world. But the glow, it called to him. He took another step, and suddenly, everything changed. The ground beneath his feet trembled, the air around him thickened. The warmth of the town faded into a cold, biting chill. He blinked, and for just a split second, the world seemed to shift. The streets behind him flickered, the buildings distorted, their pristine facades twisting and bending like a mirage. Marcus stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell?" he whispered. He turned, ready to run back home, but something stopped him. A voice, soft, almost imperceptible, whispered in his ear. "This isn't real, Marcus." He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Who said that? The world flickered again, and this time, he saw it, just for a brief moment. The town, the people, they weren't what they seemed. Beneath the surface of their perfect, smiling faces was something dark, twisted. And the glow, it wasn't just light. It was a gateway. A doorway to the truth. His hands trembled as the voice whispered again, louder this time. You need to wake up. Marcus's mind raced. Was this real? Was any of it real? Panic surged through him, and before he could stop himself, he took a step toward the light. And then, everything went dark. Marcus woke with a start, gasping for breath. His heart pounded against his ribs as if trying to escape. Sweat drenched his skin, and the sheets tangled around his legs. He blinked, disoriented, trying to shake off the remnants of a dream he couldn't fully remember. But something was wrong. The room felt different, colder, darker, despite the sunlight filtering through the windows. The familiar comfort of his bedroom now seemed distant, like a scene from a memory, slightly off and blurred at the edges. Emily was not in bed beside him. He sat up slowly, his head spinning. What happened last night? He could recall walking towards the strange light, the flicker in the town, and that voice, whispering, haunting. But now, everything seemed like a dream, or a nightmare. Emily, he called, his voice hoarse. No response. Marcus stumbled out of bed and made his way downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The table was set, as always, scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice, sitting there untouched. Everything was in its place, yet there was an eerie stillness to the house. He checked the time, 7:30 a.m., the exact time he always found Emily preparing breakfast. But something was off. He stepped outside, the chill of the morning air biting at his skin. The streets were wrong. The usual liveliness, the friendly neighbors waving, the children playing, it was all gone. Instead, an unsettling silence stretched over the town like a heavy fog. The houses stood still, like mannequins in a showroom, devoid of any movement, any life. Marcus walked down the street, his senses heightened. Every step felt like it echoed louder than it should. He turned the corner and stopped in his tracks. There, at the end of the street, Mr. Gray stood, still trimming his hedges. But today, he wasn't smiling. In fact, he wasn't moving at all. Marcus approached cautiously, his skin crawling. "Mr. Gray?" he called out. No response. "Hey, Mr. Gray!" He raised his voice, waving a hand in front of the old man's face. But the figure before him remained frozen, hedge clippers raised mid-cut, his eyes staring blankly ahead. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He leaned in closer, squinting at Mr. Gray's face. The man's skin looked strange, too smooth, too polished. Almost plastic. Marcus reached out, his hand trembling as it touched the man's arm. The skin was cold. This can't be real. Suddenly, the street flickered. The houses, the trees, the sky, they all rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond. Marcus stumbled back, his mind reeling. The perfect world around him wavered, cracked, and for a brief moment, he saw beneath it. The pristine facades, the flawless lives, it was all a facade. Beneath the surface, there was something else. Something dark, decaying, rotten. The buildings were crumbling, the trees were withered and dead. And the people, they weren't people at all. They were lifeless shells, puppets strung up in a grotesque display of normalcy. Marcus staggered, his breath coming in short gasps. No, 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 no. He turned and ran, the world flickering and distorting around him with each step. The further he went, the more the illusion unraveled. The streets stretched and warped, twisting into impossible angles. The sky above dimmed, the sun replaced by a dull, gray light that offered no warmth. He ran until he reached the town square. The fountain in the center, once a beautiful, crystal-clear stream of water, now stood dry and cracked. The statues of happy families around it were crumbling, their faces worn away by time. And standing in the middle of the square, staring directly at him, was Emily. "Emily!" Marcus shouted, rushing towards her. Relief flooded his chest as he approached, but something stopped him in his tracks. She was smiling, the same gentle, serene smile she always had. But her eyes, they were empty. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice distant, emotionless. "It's time to wake up." Before he could respond, the ground beneath him trembled. The world around him began to shake violently, and the flickering intensified. The sky tore open, revealing a swirling void of darkness beyond it. Marcus stumbled back, his mind spinning, his heart racing. He reached out towards Emily, but she simply stood there, watching him with that same empty smile. "Emily, what's happening?" Marcus cried, his voice breaking. "You need to wake up," she repeated, her voice now eerily calm. And then, with one final flicker, the world collapsed around him. Marcus awoke to a sharp, metallic taste in his mouth. His entire body ached, and his mind was a swirling haze of confusion. He blinked, struggling to make sense of his surroundings. The familiar comfort of his home was gone. The warmth, the bright sun, the perfect streets, it had all vanished. Instead, he found himself lying on a cold, hard floor, surrounded by darkness. The air was thick and heavy, filled with a damp, musty smell. He pushed himself up, wincing as his muscles protested. Where was he? The memories of what had just happened, Emily, the flickering world, the collapse of the illusion, rushed back to him in fragments. He stumbled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath him was uneven, cracked. The walls around him, if they could be called walls, were jagged and worn, covered in a thick layer of grime. Faint, eerie light flickered from broken fixtures overhead, casting long, distorted shadows along the floor. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. What is this place? As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized he wasn't alone. There were others, figures huddled in the shadows, their faces hidden in the gloom. They looked broken. Their clothes were torn, their bodies frail and malnourished. But the most disturbing thing was their eyes. They stared blankly ahead, devoid of any life or emotion, just like the people back in the town. One of the figures shifted, drawing Marcus's attention. He took a hesitant step forward. "Hello?" His voice echoed through the desolate space, but none of the figures reacted. He crouched down next to one of them, a man whose skin was pale and stretched thin over his bones. "Hey," Marcus said more urgently. "Can you hear me?" Still no response. A sickening realization dawned on Marcus. These people, they weren't alive. Or if they were, they weren't truly living. Just like the hollow shells in the illusion, these figures seemed trapped in some kind of limbo. Their bodies existed, but their minds, their souls, were gone. Marcus staggered back, horror washing over him. Is this what's happening to me? To all of us? He looked around frantically, searching for an escape. His breathing quickened, and panic clawed at his chest. "Calm down," he muttered to himself, clenching his fists. "Think. There has to be a way out of this." Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the dark space, a soft hum, barely audible at first but growing louder with each passing second. Marcus's heart raced. The sound was familiar, like the hum of machinery. He turned toward the source, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a faint, pulsing glow in the distance. It was the same light he had seen before. The one that had led him to the truth. Without hesitation, he began moving towards the glow, his steps quickening as the hum grew louder. The broken figures around him remained motionless, unaware of his presence. He didn't look back. The glow intensified as he approached, illuminating a large, rusted door set into the far wall. It looked old, ancient even, as though it had been there for centuries, hidden away beneath the surface. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door's cold metal handle. A voice echoed in his mind, Emily's voice. "You need to wake up." With a deep breath, he pulled the door open. What lay beyond was nothing like he had expected. The room was vast, stretching far beyond the limits of what should have been possible. Massive columns of machinery hummed and whirred, their inner workings pulsing with energy. Screens flickered along the walls, displaying images of the town he had known, the perfect world. But the images glitched and flickered, revealing glimpses of the decayed reality beneath. And in the center of it all, suspended in a massive glass chamber, was Emily. Marcus's heart stopped. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She floated in the chamber, her eyes closed, her body still. Wires and tubes snaked from her body, connecting her to the machinery that surrounded her. Marcus stumbled forward, his mind racing. What is this? What have they done to her? He reached the glass, his hands pressing against the cold surface. "Emily," he shouted. "Wake up! Please, wake up!" Her eyes flickered open. For a brief moment, she looked at him, truly looked at him, with recognition in her eyes. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the recognition faded, replaced by that same hollow, empty stare he had seen before. "No," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "No, no, no." The hum of the machinery grew louder, more insistent. The screens around him flickered faster, the images of the town distorting and glitching more violently. And then, a voice, a new voice, cold and mechanical, echoed through the chamber. "Subject 0412 has regained partial consciousness. Initiating reset protocol." Marcus's blood ran cold. "No!" he screamed, pounding on the glass. "You can't do this." The machinery whirred to life, the lights around him flashing red. The chamber began to glow with an ominous, pulsing light. Emily's body twitched, her eyes fluttering shut once more as the wires tightened around her. Marcus's mind raced. He had to stop it. He had to save her. But how? He looked around frantically, searching for anything that could help. His eyes landed on a control panel near the base of the chamber. Without thinking, he ran to the panel and began slamming buttons, pulling levers, trying anything to interrupt the reset protocol. The machinery groaned in protest, sparks flying as he desperately tried to shut it down. And then, with a deafening crack, the glass chamber shattered. Shards of glass rained down around Marcus as the chamber exploded in a shower of light and sound. He shielded his face, feeling the sharp edges graze his skin, but he didn't care. His eyes were locked on Emily as she fell from the suspended chamber, her body limp and lifeless. "No!" Marcus lunged forward, catching her just before she hit the cold, hard floor. Her body was cold to the touch, her skin pale and colorless. His heart pounded in his chest as he held her close, desperately shaking her. "Emily, please! Wake up! Don't leave me!" But there was no response. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow and uneven. The hum of the machinery around them grew louder, more frantic, as alarms blared from every direction. The reset protocol had been interrupted, but something far worse was happening. The room shook violently, the ground beneath them trembling as the walls began to crack. The machinery sparked and sputtered, wires ripping free from their connections. The entire structure seemed to be collapsing around them. Marcus's mind raced. He had to get out of here. He had to save Emily. With a grunt, he lifted her into his arms and stumbled towards the door. The room continued to shake, debris falling from the ceiling, the red emergency lights flickering erratically. The hum of the machines was deafening now, drowning out the sound of his own heartbeat. He reached the door, kicking it open with his foot, and rushed out into the hallway. The eerie glow from before was gone, replaced by darkness and chaos. The building was crumbling, the illusion falling apart. Whatever was holding this place together was collapsing, and fast. Marcus ran, his legs burning as he carried Emily's limp form through the twisting corridors. The walls flickered and warped around him, the illusion breaking down with each passing second. He didn't know where he was going, all he knew was that he had to escape. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. But as he ran, something strange began to happen. The further he went, the more the world around him shifted. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, elongating into impossible shapes. The floor beneath his feet rippled like water, making it harder to run. It was as if reality itself was unraveling, tearing at the seams. Marcus gritted his teeth, pushing forward. "This isn't real," he told himself. "None of this is real." But even as he thought it, doubt crept into his mind. The voice, the one that had whispered to him before, echoed in his head once more. "You need to wake up. He stumbled, nearly falling as the ground beneath him shifted again. The world around him flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw something beyond the walls of the crumbling facility. A vast, endless void. A black abyss stretching in every direction, swallowing everything in its path. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Is that what's waiting for us? He thought. Is that the truth? He didn't have time to dwell on the thought. The floor beneath him cracked, and he barely managed to jump to safety as a large section collapsed into the darkness below. His grip on Emily tightened as he looked around frantically, searching for any sign of an exit. And then he saw it, a faint light in the distance, barely visible through the chaos. It was small, but it was there. His heart leaped with hope. He ran towards the light, his legs screaming in protest, his mind racing. The walls around him continued to flicker and warp, the illusion disintegrating with every step. The closer he got to the light, the more the world around him began to break apart. Finally, he reached the source of the light, a door, barely hanging on its hinges. Beyond it, the light grew stronger, more blinding. Marcus didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open and stepped through, Emily still cradled in his arms. What he saw on the other side stopped him in his tracks. It was the town. The perfect world he had known, the pristine streets, the smiling neighbors, the clear blue sky. But it was different now. It wasn't real anymore. The edges of the world were jagged and broken, the sky flickering like static on a broken screen. The people stood frozen in place, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, their bodies motionless. The voice echoed again, louder this time. You need to wake up. Marcus's mind spun. What does that even mean? Wake up from what? And then it hit him. This wasn't just an illusion. It was a prison. A manufactured reality, designed to keep him, and everyone else, trapped in a false sense of comfort. But the cracks were showing. The truth was leaking through. And if he didn't find a way out soon, the entire world would collapse around him. He looked down at Emily, her face pale, her breathing shallow. He didn't know she could be saved. But he wasn't going to leave her here. Not in this broken, twisted version of the world. With a deep breath, Marcus made his decision. He stepped forward, into the flickering town, and began to walk. Marcus moved through the broken, flickering town with a mixture of dread and determination. The faces of the frozen townspeople stared at him, their twisted, grotesque smiles fixed in place like mannequins in a macabre display. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the cracked pavement, and every so often, the world around him shimmered, like a faulty projection on the verge of shutting down. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was Emily, her limp body growing heavier in his arms with each step. Her breath was faint, her skin pale and cold. Marcus's heart ached as he looked at her, knowing that whatever had happened to her, it wasn't just a malfunction. Something deeper, darker, was at work. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sky had begun to crack like shattered glass. Beyond it, the vast emptiness he had glimpsed earlier loomed, a swirling void that seemed to stretch into eternity. The closer he got, the more the world around him crumbled, the illusion peeling away like old paint. The voice echoed again in his mind, louder, more insistent this time. You need to wake up. Marcus gritted his teeth. I'm trying, damn it. But what did waking up even mean? He had already seen the truth, or at least, part of it. The perfect world he had known was a lie, a fabrication designed to keep him complacent. But the cracks in the illusion were growing wider, the seams tearing apart. If this was a dream, it was turning into a nightmare. As he approached the edge of the town, Marcus noticed something strange. In the distance, standing at the very brink of the crumbling world, was a figure. It was hard to make out any details from this far away, but the figure seemed familiar. His heart skipped a beat. Emily, he whispered, though the woman in his arms was still unresponsive. No, it couldn't be. He continued walking, his legs trembling under the weight of both exhaustion and confusion. As he drew closer, the figure became clearer. It wasn't Emily. It was someone else, someone he hadn't seen in years. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as the figure turned to face him. It was his mother. He froze in place, disbelief flooding his mind. This isn't real. It can't be real. His mother had died years ago, long before all of this had started. And yet, there she was, standing at the edge of the world, her eyes locked on his. "Marcus," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "You're not supposed to be here." Marcus's hands tightened around Emily. "Mom. What is this? What's going on?" She stepped forward, her movements graceful, almost ethereal. "This world isn't real, Marcus. You've always known that, haven't you? Even before the cracks started to show. You felt it. Something wasn't right." His mind raced, a flood of memories rushing back. His mother's illness, her death, the way the world had seemed to shift ever since. But this was too much. "How are you here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not," she said simply, her eyes never leaving his. "Not really?" Marcus took a step back, his heart pounding. "Then what are you? What is this?" His mother smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "This world was created to keep you safe. To keep all of you safe. But it's breaking down now. The illusion is failing, and soon, it will collapse entirely." Marcus's mind spun. Safe from what? She looked past him, toward the swirling void beyond the cracked sky. From the truth. From the reality outside this place. "It's not something you're ready to face, Marcus. Not yet." He shook his head, anger and frustration bubbling up inside him. "I don't care about the truth. I just want to save Emily. I just want to." "Emily is part of the illusion," his mother interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "She always has been." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He stared at his mother, his mouth dry. No, that's not possible. She's real. She has to be real." His mother's gaze softened. "She's as real as you made her, Marcus. But this world is falling apart. If you want to survive, if you want to wake up, you have to let her go." Marcus's heart ached, his mind reeling. He looked down at Emily, her face peaceful, her breath so faint it was almost imperceptible. How could she not be real? He had lived with her, loved her. She had been everything to him. "You don't have much time," his mother said, her voice echoing through the crumbling world. "The illusion is failing. You need to choose." Marcus stood there, torn between the weight of his love for Emily and the terrible truth his mother was revealing. The world around him continued to break down, the ground beneath his feet cracking, the void looming closer. "What happens if I don't wake up?" he asked, his voice barely audible. His mother's expression darkened. "If you stay, you'll fall into the abyss. Everything will be lost. But if you wake up, you'll face the truth. The real world." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight. He looked down at Emily, her face still and serene. Could he let her go? Could he leave her behind, knowing she might never have been real in the first place? The void crept closer, its swirling darkness hungry, ready to consume everything in its path. Marcus closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and made his choice. Marcus stood at the precipice, the weight of his decision crushing down on him like the collapsing world around him. The void loomed closer, its dark tendrils reaching out, eager to consume everything in their path. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, "Let her go. Wake up." But how could he? Emily was everything to him. She was the only constant in this twisted, crumbling reality. Yet, deep down, a part of him knew the truth. The world wasn't real. Emily wasn't real. But the pain he felt was all too real. Marcus knelt, gently laying Emily's still form on the ground. His hands trembled as he brushed a strand of hair from her face, his heart aching with the weight of what he was about to do. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Emily didn't stir. She remained as she had always been, peaceful, unchanging. Marcus stood, tears stinging his eyes as he turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the void met the last remnants of the crumbling illusion. "It's time," he told himself. "Time to wake up. With one final look back at Emily, Marcus stepped toward the void. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. Fear gripped him. What if there was nothing on the other side? What if waking up meant losing everything? But then, the voice that had guided him through all of this, spoke again, louder and clearer than ever. You've made the right choice. Marcus closed his eyes and stepped into the abyss. The sensation of falling was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. It was weightless, endless, and yet there was no fear. The darkness surrounded him, but it wasn't cold or oppressive. It was quiet, peaceful. And then, with a sudden jolt, everything changed. Light flooded his vision, blinding him. He gasped, his lungs filling with air as if he had been holding his breath for years. The weight of his body returned, and he felt the cold, hard surface beneath him. Marcus opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh, sterile light. He was in a room, a real room. The walls were white, clinical, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic. Machines hummed softly around him, their screens displaying data he didn't understand. He was lying in a bed, his body weak and sore, wires and tubes connected to his arms. Panic surged through him. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. His heart raced as he looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. And then he saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the room, watching him. She wasn't Emily. She wasn't his mother. But there was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. Marcus, she said softly, stepping closer. Her voice was gentle, soothing. It's okay. You're safe now. Marcus's mind raced. Who is she? Where am I? What happened to the world I knew? The woman must have seen the confusion in his eyes because she placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and reassuring. You've been in a simulation for a long time. We weren't sure if you'd ever wake up. A simulation? Marcus's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. She nodded, her expression kind but serious. You were part of an experiment. A virtual reality designed to test human resilience under extreme psychological conditions. The world you lived in, it wasn't real. None of it was. Marcus's head spun. The perfect town, the neighbors, Emily, it had all been a lie. How long? He asked, his voice trembling. How long was I in there? 40 years, the woman replied quietly. You've been in the simulation for 40 years. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. 40 years. An entire lifetime spent in a world that wasn't real. His mind reeled as he tried to process the enormity of it all. Everything he had known, everything he had believed, it had all been part of a controlled environment, a test. But why? Why had they done this to him? The woman seemed to sense his questions. It wasn't supposed to last this long, she explained. The simulation was meant to help humanity survive in case of future cataclysmic events. But something went wrong. The system malfunctioned, and you became trapped. We tried to wake you, but the deeper you went, the harder it became to reach you. Marcus stared at her, his heart heavy. Emily, he whispered. The woman hesitated, then shook her head. She wasn't real, Marcus. None of them were. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily, his mother, the life he had known, it was all part of the illusion. His chest tightened with grief, but there was also a strange sense of relief. He had woken up. He had escaped. The woman offered him a small, sympathetic smile. You did it, Marcus. You survived. Marcus closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The reality of the situation was overwhelming, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was free. He had woken up.